You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Clifford Winston of the Brookings Institution. Clifford, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Good to be here.
So our topic for today is infrastructure. Clifford is the author of numerous books and articles on this subject, both relating to airlines and highways. So Clifford, one of your articles has the provocative title, "Can Privatization of U.S. Highways Improve Motorist Welfare?" So let's start with that big question. Tell me, how do you approach that question?
Okay, well, let me first motivate it a bit, since people probably are wondering, what does privatization have to do with this, since most of the systems are public. So, where I got started on this was earlier work where I'd assess the performance of the public systems, whether it be highways, airports, or what have you. These were all in the public sector. And my work and other work indicated that there were vast inefficiencies with these systems related to basically economic policy, mispricing, misinvestment, inefficient production, things of that nature. So, given the poor performance of the public sector, I turned to the question, well, could the private sector do any better? And looked at the case for privatizing infrastructure. And that's really what led to that paper.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about some of those inefficiencies in the current system, because I think we're so used to them. We're so used to, say, sitting in traffic during a traffic jam. We don't think of it as, an inefficiency that could be avoided by having different incentives. I think it was Brian Kaplan who said that, if you woke up any economist in the middle of the night and said, "Quick, what's the solution to traffic jams?" they'd tell you peak load pricing right away, regardless of ideological bent or whether they're, any kind of economist would probably universally agree that if we priced the roads during rush hour such that people had to pay more than people who are more elastic in their travel times, people who don't care whether they're driving it right at 5 p.m. or 2 hours earlier or later would adjust, and then you could have fewer traffic jams. But what other kind of inefficiencies do you see in infrastructure?
Okay, well, a related one is there's certainly mispricing of cars, and you're correct, certainly, that cars are not being charged for their contribution to congestion. There's also the mispricing of trucks and the damage they do to the roads. And that damage is based on weight of the truck per axle weight. And they're not charged based on that. They're charged like cars based on, for the most part, the gasoline tax, which is really sort of a pathological way to charge them, because generally what you want are trucks with more axles. And what that does is it spreads out the truck's load and the pressure that's applying to the pavement over more axles. And so that reduces the pressure that it's applying to the pavement and the damage it does to the road. And the problem with the gas tax is trucks with fewer axles get better fuel economy. So you're sort of rewarding trucks, if you will, that are doing more damage to the road, which is exactly the opposite that you want to do. So you want to encourage trucks to get axles and reduce the damage they're doing to the road, and explicitly charge them for a pavement tax. So pavement wear tax. So that's another example of mispricing. When it comes to bridges, the damage that trucks do to those is based on total weight. So there you'd want some sort of a gross vehicle weight tax, again, to make trucks a bit more responsive to the damage they're doing to bridges and the stress that they're placing on those. So that's sort of the basic range of pricing. Then we go on to a variety of other inefficiencies on the production side, including investment and use of labor and capital technology, so on and so forth. And it gets to be, a pretty long list. All of these items in their own way are contributing to inefficiencies and the poor performance of the road system. We can switch the conversation to airline infrastructure and runways, and the same kinds of ideas are at work there. The need for congestion pricing and the perverse pricing that we currently have, which is based on the weight of aircraft, when in fact, big planes and little planes delay planes and contribute to congestion somewhat equally. In fact, the smaller planes tend to create more congestion delay because the big planes have to stay further away from them because weight turbulence could damage them and knock them out of the sky, so to speak. So you'd want, again, some sort of congestion price that would be applied to all aircraft. And what you have now is a price that's largely borne by the bigger aircraft, even though the smaller aircraft are contributing to congestion also. So we see the same kind of stories repeating, for the similar types of infrastructure. And as I said, it runs the gamut from pricing to investment, technology, so on and so forth.
Okay, so a big part of the pattern here is that some cost that people, private actors impose, whether they're trucking companies or airlines, some part of the cost they impose is not properly captured in the price that they pay, and that's correct. That leads them to impose more of those costs than they optimally should, or than they would if they were facing the proper incentives.
Yes, and then you see the symptoms of that in things like congestion and, for that matter, budget deficits and concerns about financing these systems. Again, those are symptoms of the failure to use efficient pricing in this case, but also investment and production guidelines.
So you then turn to this question of both deregulation and privatization of some of these infrastructure, these parts of infrastructure. This isn't a work of sort of anarchist literature about how the entire system could bootstrap itself with no intervention. This is about policy changes, plausible policy changes that we could make or some places have made. So how does privatization, how would it affect these kinds of incentives?
Well, it's this is not an easy question because we really have little experience with this. Let me just quickly draw a parallel. When we spoke about deregulation in the 70s in the United States, there already were experiments at work. That is, we had intrastate deregulation of airlines and trucks in certain states. And one could draw on those experiences and project what would be the effect of deregulation nationwide. Now, with privatization, we don't really have that, at least in the U.S. And there's not all that much foreign experience to draw on, although there's some. So it's challenging, and it's something that one has to really approach analytically and develop empirical models to get some feel for the kinds of effects we did. So these were things that I worked on with a colleague, Jia Yan of Washington State University, and some published articles in the Journal of Public Economics. And these were basically trying to characterize situations where roads could compete. So we envisioned a highway where we could have two private providers, either dividing the highway in terms of separate lanes or two separate roads, and looking at whether competition could lead to plausible improvements in motorist welfare. That is, they would be paying more in terms of charges to use the road, but they would get improvements in terms of travel time. And we showed that there were situations under which it was plausible. But to be honest with you, I think a lot of the institutional challenges of setting up this kind of competition, especially given that you're going to be requiring entrepreneurs who have no experience really with doing this. A key thing to keep in mind is that in the case of deregulation, you did have people that were experienced in running airlines and railroads and so on and so forth, even though this was a regulated industry, but they had that kind of experience. We don't have private sector experience in the U.S. with people running highways, and there isn't all that much experience worldwide. So you'd have to bring in people with little experience with adjusting to business cycles, unanticipated shocks and costs and demand, so on and so forth. And so, as a practical matter, we wanted to lay out possibilities, and wherever there was interest in plausible ways of setting up experiments for policymakers to do that. But, to be honest with you, I think we were quite cautious in the case of highways as to how far to push privatization beyond anything more than let's see if we can experiment and see how the private sector could do. Now, in contrast, I think airports are a much more plausible candidate for privatization because you already do have, implicitly anyway, forms of competition among airports in a lot of metropolitan areas in the U.S. So where I am in Washington, arguably I can choose among Washington Dulles, Reagan National, and Baltimore Washington airports, 3 airports right there. And if you're in New York, you've got a number of choices. If you're in Boston, New England, you've got a number of choices. If you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, you have some choices. San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco, so on and so forth. So there, I think you've got a much more plausible case for privatization. And again, we modeled possibilities where we'd have airports competing, setting different types of user charges, and in the process also different types of service in terms of delays. But then we also brought private airports that exist now into the picture and considered general aviation, which does contribute to congestion and delays, and try to see what effect then really segregating a lot of that traffic to the smaller private airports could do. And again, outline possibilities where traveler welfare could improve with the combination of admittedly higher peak period landing charges, but much faster service and less delay. Again, this is the kind of thing that is a starting point for experiments, although admittedly these are scholarly studies and people tend to like things that are a bit more intuitive. But before sort of ending the comments about privatization, there is something else that, since I wrote that paper that you mentioned at the beginning, that's come along that really is in some ways far more revolutionary and likely to have much more positive effects. And that's changes in technology. And specifically what I'm talking about in the case of highways is the growing development and eventual adoption of autonomous vehicles. And in the case of air travel, significant improvements in air traffic control with a satellite-based system. So what I'm really more enthusiastic about these days, even though I still, encourage interest and potential experimentation and privatization, are technologies that are getting closer and closer all the time. And that it would be extremely helpful if policymakers were much more open to the potential benefits we're going to get from these new technologies. And I'm actually somewhat encouraged because at least in the US, we're seeing that Congress has actually been pretty active in trying to get autonomous vehicle legislation moving forward. So we see the adoption of those vehicles. But the advantage, as I say, of the new technology is they're going to basically accomplish an awful lot of what public policy should have accomplished if it were efficient. But again, this is something that technology can accomplish to a pretty significant extent.
Yeah, I think with the experience of ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft, we all saw that there could be this new technology that was obviously very beneficial to consumers and non-incumbent suppliers of these ride-sharing services, and that existing incumbents like the taxi cab or the holder of taxi cab medallions or licenses could come along and effectively fight the new technology and effectively block it in many areas. And the fact that they can do that made people nervous for what is the most exciting future development, which is autonomous cars. And so it looks like people are moving the politicians are moving to make sure that doesn't happen with autonomous cars, that you can't have, say, the local government of every city or town decide whether to ban the use of autonomous cars, which would, of course, really harm their adoption. I heard about a potential bill blocking local areas from preventing adoption of autonomous cars. Do you know if that passed or if it's something that has just been talked about?
Okay, so what's happening is this is taken up by Congress, and so the House of Representatives, they passed their bill, their Self-Drive Act, which basically is going to make the, quote, safety aspect of autonomous vehicles the responsibility of the federal government. And the Senate is working on their version of this bill. And, there may be differences, but, the expectation is they too will pass a bill fairly shortly, and then the two houses will be able to reconcile any differences. And then what that bill will do is basically signal the official start of the race. That is, it's going to say, look, the federal government is now going to be responsible for regulating safety in the same way that they do for non-autonomous vehicles. Okay. And generally, the states and the cities are not going to have that responsibility. And they're going to then allow the autonomous vehicles to begin testing. And as part of the legislation, the Secretary of Transportation is going to say, okay, here are the number of vehicles that each manufacturer is going to allow to have tests. Now, it's not entirely clear whether that legislation will allow automakers to go in every city they want. It's possible that certain cities can say, no, we don't want you testing here, and they'll be able to block that. But not clear. Still not sure about that. But in any case, testing is going on now. But I think the sort of official testing with the goal toward adoption will begin once that legislation is passed. And then what's going to happen is then the automakers and technology companies will be working with the Secretary of Transportation, Department of Transportation, to finalize the standards that those autonomous vehicles must meet. So there's going to be learning, and they're going to be educating, obviously, the DOT. And at some point, they'll basically say, okay, look, we think we've got all the problems sorted out. Let's go through them, see if you agree and you're convinced. And then DOT will say, yes, we are. And then here are the standards then that we want all manufacturers of autonomous vehicles to meet. At which point then they'll be ready to be sold to the public. And then we will turn to the adoption of autonomous vehicles, first mixing with non-autonomous vehicles, and then eventually, they will be the major form of transportation. At this point, most of the attention is on automobiles and not yet with the trucks and buses, but they'll be moving those along, sure enough. So that's sort of the process as we see it. And, increasingly it's becoming clearer and clearer that the auto manufacturers, technology companies have made a lot of progress, and they're continuing to make very rapid progress. So that first stage of getting to the point where Department of Transportation feels that they've got a safe product and that they're comfortable with setting standards that the providers can meet, it's not going to be that far away. It could just be a matter of several years, let's say, and then it'll be another bulk of time when people start adopting them. But we're not really looking at 20 or 30 years down the road. I think it's going to be much closer to 15 years.
Yeah. There's an issue in technology, or a pattern with new technologies, that people who are very close to them, people who maybe work with related technologies, often overestimate how long it's going to take to develop. It's a case where the inside view is often more pessimistic than the outside view. The outside view being, hey, we've made this much progress so far, we do about this much per year, just extrapolate that out. Self-driving cars within the next decade is not implausible. And let's just make a note about the federal government regulating these cars. Regulations sort of face something that economists call the tragedy of the anti-commons, where the tragedy of the commons is where nobody has property rights, nobody has the power to restrict you from using some common pool resource, and so it's overused. But if you have many different regulators, if you have a national regulator and a state level regulator and a local level regulator, all with the power to restrict something, then you're going to get the opposite, the inverse effect to the tragedy of the commons, where it puts so many extra costs of complying on this new technology that it could bog it down. It could prevent it from being profitable. And so if from the perspective of these manufacturers, knowing that they can just comply with one set of federal regulations and then sell to the entire U.S. market is going to be encouraging for them, making those fixed costs of developing the technology.
No, that's right. No, that's an important point. And again, it's encouraging that a number of policymakers have seen that, and they do want to avoid the tragedy, if you will, of many regulators and get that process moving. But there is one other point, though, that I should add, and that ties in with the beginning of our conversation. And that's, we still do have existing inefficiencies in the infrastructure. Now, this infrastructure was designed for non-autonomous vehicles. And now this infrastructure is going to have to be used by autonomous vehicles. Now, autonomous vehicles can still make progress in reducing congestion and delays. Let me give you the most obvious area where they can do it. A large source of delays comes from accidents. People are rubbernecking and they're looking at the crash, or going unusually slowly, and so on and so forth. Autonomous vehicles are not going to do that. They're not going to rubberneck. They're just going to keep moving along at a more steady pace. And so all the delays that are associated with accidents are going to be much, much less. And as I said, that does actually count for a surprisingly large fraction of delays. So we can certainly make progress there. We'll certainly make progress in safety. And, in general, we can make progress in reducing delays and congestion given the technology. However, there is this concern about induced demand. That is, as the improvements in congestion delays occur, more people then will want to use the highway system during peak periods. And those have been people who've been put off by congestion and either traveled off peak, used alternative modes, or not even traveled at all. All right, so that then brings us back to pricing. So the call for efficient pricing is going to resonate even more strongly in a world of autonomous vehicles, because otherwise a lot of the benefits from autonomous vehicles can be compromised. And same thing with pricing of trucks. Autonomous vehicles are going to be able to react to a lot of phenomena and make improvements in our travel, but it's not going to be easy for them if they have to deal with potholes. Are they going to just run over them and be damaged? Are they going to have to slow up, which would disturb the traffic flow? So again, the kind of efficient pricing that would reduce the damage to the road surface that is attributable to trucks, it becomes very important. So I think the positive news is we have a technology on the horizon that can basically accomplish an awful lot of what the public sector should have accomplished with efficient policy, that is reducing delays and even improving safety. Okay. And these benefits are not only going to be accrued in the transportation system, but actually an entire economy, because these congestion and delays will affect international trade, they'll affect labor markets, they'll affect urban agglomeration economies, all sorts of things related to an economy will be affected. But unless we again have efficient policy to support what the autonomous vehicle is trying to do, a pretty significant share of their benefits will be compromised. So, we're taking a step forward with the technology, but we're still back to the problem of efficient policy and getting that implemented to make sure we get the full benefits from that technology.
Yeah, there are almost too many potential changes to our society to even list or think about in terms of autonomous vehicles. The way things work now, you have a lot of urban real estate markets in places like San Francisco and LA and New York, where living in the city is extremely expensive. There's a very limited supply of housing, partly limited by zoning and land use restrictions. And so there's an inverse relationship between commute time and housing and rental costs. So people who have a higher opportunity cost of commuting will live in the city and pay more, and then people with lower opportunity costs will commute more. Some people commuting an hour or more each day to get to and from their work. But what happens when your commute is also productive time, when you can sit in your car and either work on things or do less productive but more entertaining things, watch YouTube videos, listen to I suppose you can listen to podcasts in your car already, but what we might expect to happen is that commutes will get longer, or people will be more willing to put up with longer commutes. Do you have a comment on any?
Or shorter. I mean, it could be that some of these extreme commutes, where people are taking different modes and, taking an hour and a half, if they get in their autonomous vehicle, the flow, might be improved from that just alone. But generally, you're right. I mean, there'll be significant changes in land use involving changes in residential location, where probably certain people say, look, I'm paying, quite a bit to be close in, and I can live now further out and pay less and, still have a productive commute, and things will work out. I can eat breakfast in my car or whatever, and or work. And so, yes, we're going to see, those kinds of changes as you suggest, and more. Obviously, the need for parking, downtown parking, will be much less. And if we go to the shared model, like the Uber model, where people don't own vehicles anymore but just share them, that obviously will add another dimension to the kinds of changes that we see. So, on-street parking will be less important, and the vehicles will be stored in garages, out of the main city center, things of this nature. So, yes, there's all sorts of responses that we can speculate about now, but as often happens, of course, with a new technology, there will be many things that we don't anticipate that'll occur. But again, these tend to be on the positive side and just add to the benefits of the innovation. But again, let me stress that all of this is still conditional on using an infrastructure which historically has been very inefficient. And we're going to get more benefits if infrastructure policy itself is aligned more closely with the vehicles that are using it. And let me just add also, a more at least optimistic note about that, historically economists have been recommending, for decades, if not centuries, a lot of the things that I've been talking about in terms of efficient infrastructure policies. And policymakers have just simply not responded. And people will point out, look, you just don't get the politics of this. And, you're just tone deaf. I think in this case, there are reasons to suspect that it may be different. And the reason will be something that we've already started to observe. That is, people who are sharing vehicles are now accustomed to paying charges, whether it be surcharges or other kinds of charges for their trip. And so the notion of having sort of almost a built-in feature of an autonomous vehicle, a charge for congestion, even a charge for pollution, may not seem so foreign and may not be resisted as strongly as it is today when people own their vehicles and are not used to these kinds of charges. So, that's certainly one reason to think, maybe people won't have the kind of responses that they've had in the past. Of course, other things will be, people are seeing the performance of the vehicles and what they could be. And to the extent that it becomes apparent that policymakers are leaving, billion-dollar bills on the sidewalk because of their inefficiencies, that may cost them politically. And, there may be then a much more serious attitude about trying to implement policies that promote efficiency than they have in the past. So, although I think it's going to be critical that we make improvements in our infrastructure that we've resisted making for a long time, I think there could very well be forces that lead policymakers to at least make some of these changes.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about some of the technical advancements that have already been made that help with things like pricing congestion. This is before my time, but my understanding is in the old days there was something called a toll booth that you had to stop at and hand money to someone, which of course is immensely costly. You have to have a person there and you have to stop traffic in order to get payment from them. But nowadays, there's just cameras and they photograph your license plate and then they send you an electronic bill, and it's much more efficient. So that's one example of a technical advancement that has presumably helped. Well, first, has it helped, and are there other advancements that have had similar effects?
Yeah, there's no question. Certainly that's obviously made people more receptive, and where they have an option to use congestion pricing where the prices are administered electronically, we see people responding to that with these HOT lanes where people have the option to use certain lanes, but they're going to have to pay a toll for it. But the actual payment is again done electronically. You've got a transponder in your vehicle. You'll go through a certain point. They'll take money off the money you have, and you'll proceed without much delay. And I think we're thinking about similar things when it comes to autonomous vehicles. Although, again, it may very well be just a built-in feature of the vehicle. This has been something, believe it or not, that's actually been recommended by a congressman in Oregon, who said that we should have these kinds of efficient charges part of autonomous vehicles, where there can be, congestion tolling. People will know what these tolls would be in advance. They'll be given options of alternative routes and prices, and that could go a long way to improving traffic flows, so on and so forth. So yes, we've already gone in this direction. I think it's now reached the level of policymakers where they see the potential benefits from doing this. And as I said, the politics may be lining up better if we really do move to a institutional arrangement where vehicles are no longer owned, but for the most part they're shared through some kind of subscription service or something like that.
So the American Society of Civil Engineers gives annual report cards to U.S. infrastructure. They do it state by state. I think this year's they gave the country as a whole a D+. How much attention do you think people should pay to ratings like that? Of course, it's coming from civil engineers, not economists. Do you think rating like that accounts for some of the efficiency concerns and congestion pricing and things like that? Or is it a good measure? Should people pay attention to it?
Yeah, my problem with that measure is its implications. And not surprisingly, coming from the engineering community, the implications are we need to spend more. So, along with that grade is associated usually some figure as to how much more money we need to spend to upgrade the infrastructure. And I think this has been the mentality that has existed, certainly in the US and probably around the world, for forever. That is, the way to solve infrastructure problems is for the government to spend more money. Build more roads, maintain them better, spend more money on maintenance, upgrade them, so on and so forth. When it's clear, as we've been talking about, as we've been discussing, simple things like pricing, which don't require money from the government, can go a long way to accomplish a lot of the goals that spending wants to do. So, instead of rebuilding a highway that's been damaged by trucks, how about charging trucks for the damage they do to the pavement so they don't require so much maintenance and rehabilitation of vehicles? Instead of adding and spending a lot of money putting 2 more lanes on a highway, how about charging congestion prices, right? So this, I think, has been my concern with the whole engineering mentality, is it ignores inefficiencies that can be addressed by pricing. And I think, again, the direction where autonomous vehicles are going is to effectively do what efficient policy should have done. But even though they're going in the right direction, they'll go even further if now we finally start adopting efficient policies.
Right. My impression is very similar of that report. It sort of assumes that people's behaviors and their need for highways and transportation are fixed in some sense. It doesn't really acknowledge that if you spend another $1 billion building highways, but you don't give people the right incentives, then you've subsidized driving and encourage people to adjust their lifestyles to be more built around the car and transportation on roads and highways that they don't fully pay for. So for instance, we can see big box stores as being subsidized in a sense by infrastructure investments. If you don't have to pay the cost of the highway between your house and Walmart, or as long as you don't pay the full cost, then you're more likely to shop there than at your local grocery that you could maybe walk to. And that is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. People talk about big box stores in the context of welfare programs or other things subsidizing them. I think that's a little wrong-headed, but besides the point of this conversation. Do you want to comment on the way these highways are funded? So highway construction projects, if you're expanding a highway, if you're building a new highway, are generally financed at the federal level, but then maintaining infrastructure, if you're filling in potholes or something like that, that's generally done at the local level. Do you know of any effects that has on the incentives for politicians?
Well, let's just clarify that. Remember, in the United States, all levels of government are involved. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, the states are going to take the ultimate responsibility. In other words, there is money that goes into the Federal Highway Trust Fund from gasoline taxes. And then that money is doled back to the states. All right. Now, right there, by the way, is an inefficiency in the sense that the allocation of these funds is not based on explicit efficiency considerations. So you'll find that big states that are not particularly congested get a pretty large share of the money. And that is, they get more back than they put in, which was necessary for the whole country to go along with a federal highway program that we have today. But in any case, so the federal money will go back to the states, okay, basically by formula. Then the states, within the states, they have to allocate the money, and they're what they call metropolitan planning organizations will put in their bids and say, here's where it's got to go. And there'll be parts of the state that aren't particularly congested and don't have much traffic, but they'll say, look, we need ours. And so they'll get funds too. So you have this somewhat convoluted process where you've got a lot of interests that are looking at the funds. And then there are incentives oftentimes to get money used more for capital projects rather than actual maintenance. Politically, no one gets elected by saying, look, I maintain your road better, as opposed to saying I built you a new road and trying to get those kinds of things done. And then we look at the actual process of doing this kind of work and realizing that we have legislation called the Davis-Bacon Act that effectively raises wages for labor, making them being paid at prevailing union wage rates, even if people might be willing to work for less. So you have inflation of labor costs there. You have made in America constraints, buy America constraints that could possibly increase capital costs. So the actual costs of the project are inflated. And then there the regulations themselves. So if you actually want to do a project, you have environmental regulations and permitting that has to be satisfied. That could take several years. And then there are work zones. So when you're actually completing the project, generally there's delays that are caused by that project as the workers construct work zones, closing a lane, that kind of thing, and rerouting traffic. All of those things contribute to the overall costs of infrastructure projects, and they are quite exorbitant. And this is just other examples of why we need to focus much more on the efficiency of the spending that we do on our infrastructure, and wherever possible to supplement it either by efficient pricing or new technologies that can accomplish an awful lot of what the spending is trying to do.
One thing I hear a lot about related to highway funds is you hear stories about times when the federal government of the United States will threaten to withdraw a state's highway funds if they don't enact some policy that the federal government wants. So as a sort of side consequence of funding infrastructure in this way, you have a reduction in the sovereignty, essentially, of states. You have the federal government able to enact policies that it maybe couldn't legally or practically have enacted before, but now it wields this additional power. Do you want to comment on that as a sort of side effect of this whole infrastructure funding regime?
Well, there's certain money that is allocated by formula from the trust fund. So they can't just say, we're not going to give you your money from that, right? That's going to cause some problems. But there's always other money. You've heard of the Big Dig project in Boston. That was obviously turned into a multi-billion-dollar project that went beyond what normally would be funded by standard sources, and government official, the federal government kicked in, and there are many other projects like that. So yes, I think if you want to play ball and get that kind of funding, you may have to make compromises elsewhere, or you may have to be in a very powerful political position where your state can get that kind of funding. So, we see a lot of that. And that would certainly come around, if we move toward high-speed rail. There'll be certain areas that want those kinds of systems and the huge funds that those require. We're seeing a bit of that already in California, where they're trying to get federal help, for their system to get that going. And no doubt, other parts of the country will want their share too. So yes, I think, that kind of politicization, it becomes quite costly and inefficient. And people, quote, really focus more on just getting the project. So, if you mentioned the kinds of economic considerations we're talking about here, cost benefit analysis, efficient operation, so on and so forth, they won't pay any attention or don't even know what you're talking about, let alone care about it. Their attitude will simply be, look, we wanted this project, we got it funded, and it's complete. What's the problem?
Yeah, it seems like if, what economists call the social planner, if we had a benevolent sort of person in charge of where to allocate infrastructure spending, they might say they might build a high-speed rail line between two heavily populated areas that have a lot of traffic between them. But the way things work now, if you need the senator from a particular state to vote on some totally unrelated bill, and then you offer him a high-speed rail, a federally financed high-speed rail line, then that's not going to reflect the underlying efficiencies of building or not building that. It's going to reflect political concerns that are orthogonal or unrelated to the actual needs, infrastructure needs of the country. You see this with local bus routes where they're set by politics and not necessarily by demand. So you have a bus driving through, a wealthy neighborhood where everyone drives and having only one or two passengers on it, and having lineups for buses in busier areas. Do you want to?
That's right. It's almost impossible to often get new lines. And at the same time, it's almost impossible to get rid of lines that are hardly used.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of our time here. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any really important considerations that people should absorb from this conversation?
Well, I think it might be helpful just to sort of pull everything together. I think, we've hit all the important points, but now, I think what I can say is that, historically thinking about infrastructure has really been dominated by what I would call an engineering mentality. That is, we need to spend more money, spend. And insufficient attention has been paid on the efficiency of the spending and the overall efficient performance of the system. That has led to symptoms that everybody sees. Huge budget deficits in transportation projects and the lack of funding for areas, congestion, delays, concerns about safety, pollution, what have you. And that all then takes us back to, yes, these are symptoms, but they're symptoms of inefficient policies. Now, while the government continues to have a status quo bias, the private sector has come up with new technologies that could go a long way to improving the system and effectively doing things the public sector should have done a long time ago. And those things are coming sooner rather than later. But the new technology is going to have to operate on a system that was designed for older technologies, and policymakers have to respond, upgrade their policies, and align them much better with the new technologies. And then I think we will get the full benefits of these new technologies. So that's sort of where we are now. But I think hopefully as more people become aware of the improvements that we could get thanks to the private sector and these systems, that there will also be then greater support for aligning public policies toward infrastructure with the new technologies to improve their performance.
My guest today has been Clifford Winston. Clifford, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you.